On July 15, 1943, at dusk, along an unremarkable for a strode outside Kursk, 200 German soldiers were advancing slowly. They had no idea that every inch of ground beneath their feet had been transformed into a death trap by a Yakut hunter. He could barely hold a rifle steady. 11 minutes later, 89 cold corpses lay scattered across the road. Throughout the entire slaughter, not a single shot had been fired. The man who orchestrated all this sat on a hillside 300 meters away. He held a pair of binoculars, watching his handiwork with an expressionless face. His name was Mikhail Tatarinov, 22 years old that year. He was the worst marksman in the entire regiment and the most terrifying nightmare the Germans had ever encountered. The Germans gave him a nickname, the Trap Maker, while his own people called him the Yakut Shaman. How could a man who could not hit a target at 50 meters become the deadliest killer of the entire war? The answer lies in a single phrase: a good hunter never shoots. A good hunter uses his brain. To understand all this, we must go back 2 years to September 12, 1941, at the recruit training ground outside Kursk. 42-year-old Sergeant Kravtsov was staring at the target in disbelief. 5 rounds fired, 5 complete misses. Private Tatarinov stood at the firing line, clutching a Mosin Nagant rifle like a man holding a venomous snake. All 43 recruits in the line were laughing uncontrollably, some even crying with laughter. Kravtsov, his face flushed red, rushed up to Mikhail and jabbed a finger at his nose. "Is your mother blind or crippled?" Mikhail said nothing. He could not explain to this furious sergeant what he had done in 20 years of life in the Yakut Taiga. He had personally captured over 300 sables, 170 Arctic foxes, and 22 wolves. Even less could he explain that his father, Yegor Nikolaevich Tatarinov, was recognized as the top hunter in the entire WWII region. 3 generations of their family had hunted without ever touching a gun. Deep in the vast taiga of WWII, the Tatar in Novies observed an iron law. When Mikhail was 8 years old, his father spoke these words to him inside their wood-hung cabin. Outside it was 40 degrees below zero. The firewood in the stove crackled, and on the table lay a freshly skinned sable pelt. Deep in the vast taiga of WWII, the Tatarinov family had observed an iron law for generations. When Mikhail was 8, his father spoke these words to him. Outside it was 40 degrees below zero. The firewood in the stove crackled, and on the table lay a freshly skinned sable pelt. Yegor stroked the smooth fur and said to his son, "Look carefully. How clean this pelt is, not even a large hole. Guns only tear the fur, ruin the appearance. Fur traders will not even pay half the price. In contrast, traps bring the cleanest death. The prey dies, but the pelt remains perfectly intact." He told his son to remember, a truly good hunter never shoots. A good hunter relies on his brain. Young Mikhail carved this sentence into his bones. From the age of 8, his father took him into the mountains to hunt, and once they entered the taiga, they would stay for weeks at a time. Father and son lived in a wooden cabin, checking old traps and setting new ones every day. In this snow-covered forest, Mikhail learned to read the language of the earth. He learned where the sable's footprints passed, where they stopped, where they turned, where the Arctic foxes denned, on which hillside. He learned which snowy meadows the wolf packs would surround in the depths of winter. His father taught him to think like a beast. If you were a fox, which path would you take? Where would you eat? Where would you shelter from the cold? A trap should be set at a choke point the prey must pass through, not by chasing blindly across the mountains. This was not mere technique, but a profound survival philosophy. Do not blindly chase prey, but accurately predict its behavior. You do not need to run desperately through the snow. You only need to wait quietly at the critical position. By 16, Mikhail had surpassed his master. He seemed able to feel the pulse of the taiga, knowing a week in advance which trail a sable would slip along. He knew which slope an Arctic fox would dig its den in spring. and which snowy field the wolf pack would hunt in deep winter. Hunters from 10 miles around came to the Tatarinov household for advice, and when Mikhail produced his hand-drawn maps of game trails, the old hunters marveled. They asked how he could predict animal movements with such uncanny accuracy. Mikhail would simply shrug calmly and say, "Watch more, think more." The Tatarinov family did own one gun, an old Burden rifle passed down from his grandfather, but it was virtually useless in daily life. It only came out in the most desperate situations, when facing a maddened bear or cornered by a starving wolf pack. In all his years, Mikhail had fired that gun exactly twice, and both times he missed completely. In all his years, Mikhail had fired that gun exactly twice, and both times he missed completely. War erupted on June 22, 1941, but the news did not reach the remote village of Sun until 3 days later. The village radio crackled in undoubt, and the only receiver sat in the village council office. On June 25th, the chairman of the collective farm gathered all the able-bodied men in the square and announced loudly, "Comrades, war has come. The Germans have invaded. Draft notices will arrive soon." Mikhail stood in the crowd thinking war sounded as distant and unreal as another world. Germany was thousands of kilometers away. What grudge could a hunter who spent his life deep in the Yakut forests possibly hold against the Germans? But the draft notice arrived on schedule in August, and Mikhail, born in 1921, was officially conscripted. The notice required him to report to the military commissariat in Vilyasik by August 9th. Before leaving, his mother wiped away tears. Before leaving, his mother wiped away tears while his father sat smoking his pipe in silence. Just as Mikhail was about to walk out the door, his father pulled him aside and delivered his final words of wisdom. "I know you cannot even hold a gun steady. I never taught you to shoot because hunting never required it. But the battlefield is a place where men kill, and I do not know how a clumsy fellow like you will survive at the front. But you must remember one thing: wild beasts and humans are not so different. They both feel fear. They both have habits they cannot break, and they both have paths they must travel. On the battlefield, watch more and use your brain. That is the only real skill I have to teach you." Carrying his father's counsel, Mikhail set out on his journey. The trip to Irkutsk took him 3 whole weeks, first by horse to Yakutsk, then by steamboat down the Lena River to Ust-Ikut, and finally by train. He had never seen so many people in his life, never seen a train, never seen a steamboat, and certainly never seen a city full of brick buildings. He stared blankly at the villages flashing past the train window, wondering how people survived in places without toga, in places where you could not set traps. The recruit training camp was stationed 20 kilometers from Irkutsk, housing 2,000 draftees from across eastern Siberia. Most were armed boys who handled firearms with ease, having grown up shooting ducks, rabbits, and roe deer, knowing instinctively how to grip, aim, and squeeze the trigger. But Mikhail was utterly clueless. When they issued him a Mosin-Nagant rifle, he held it like a man gripping a poisonous snake. The stock was cold and hard, the barrel too long, and the bolt extremely stiff. Instructors showed him step by step how to load, aim, and fire, and though Mikhail mimicked their movements, something inside him resisted. He could not articulate the feeling, but the idea of killing someone from a distance without looking into their eyes felt deeply wrong. On the firing range, he embarrassed himself time and again, and Sergeant Kraft so regularly hauled him out of the formation as a cautionary example. Tatarinov, step out, show everyone how to shoot blindly. Mikhail would step out, fire, and miss perfectly. His comrades roared with laughter, someone shouting from the ranks, "Hey Yakut, how did you hunt sables before?" by talking them into surrender. Mikhail bit his lip and said nothing. After 3 weeks of training, Company Commander Captain Gromvup summoned him to his office. Gromvup was 30-4, a professional soldier who had fought in the Soviet-Finnish War, with a Red Star medal on his chest. He sat behind his desk with Tatarinov personnel file in front of him and got straight to the point. Private Tatarinov. In 3 weeks of training, you have set the worst shooting record in this camp history. 120 rounds fired, only 9 hits. Yet the collective farm evaluation states in black and white that you are the top hunter in the entire district. How do you explain this? Mikhail paused, then answered honestly, Comrade Captain, I am a trapper. I never shoot. My family has never used guns for generations. We hunt with traps. Clean-back traps? For catching sables? Mikhail nodded. Sables, Arctic foxes, and wolves. Gromvup frowned. You catch wolves with traps too. Mikhail explained that catching wolves required pit traps and snares, as ordinary traps could not hold a wolf. Gromvup stared at him for a full minute, then spoke slowly. So you are a master of traps? Mikhail straightened up. Comrade Captain, yes, that is the only thing I know how to do. On September 20-8th, 1940-1, Private Mikhail Tatarinov was transferred from the infantry company to the combat engineer platoon. His military ID now bore an additional line specialist combat engineer. No one could have predicted that these few words would completely transform his fate. He certainly never imagined that 2 years later he would stand beside a forest road outside Kursk, surrounded by 80-9 German corpses. At 4-40 in the morning on January 17th, 1940-2, Private Mikhail lay prone in the snow, 120 meters ahead of the German positions. At that moment, he did something no other combat engineer in the platoon had ever done. Instead of rushing to plant mines, he observed. He pressed himself against the frozen earth, lying motionless for 40 full minutes. His eyes locked on the German sentry patrolling back and forth along the trench. The temperature had dropped to -30-5. His fingers were numb inside his gloves, and icicles formed on his eyelashes. But Mikhail remained as still as a stone. He silently counted the sentry steps, timing the patrol, memorizing the route. After 40 minutes, he knew this German habits intimately. The man walked 60-8 steps north, stopped in front of the bunker to light a cigarette, smoked for 3 minutes, then turned back. At the southernmost point of his route, the sentry never lingered, and the moment he turned around, there was an 11-second blind spot. 11 seconds, more than enough time to plant a mine. The winter of 1940-2 along the Volkhov front was pure hell, filled with blizzards, starvation, and death. Mikhail was assigned to the 216th Rifle Division, which was holding the line at Tikhvin. The Germans were attacking furiously, trying to sever the last railway connecting besieged Leningrad to the rear. Artillery bombardments filled the days, and reconnaissance raids filled the nights with mortal danger. Every morning the casualty list grew longer with unfamiliar names. Lieutenant Orlov Combat Engineer Platoon had started with 19 men, but after just 1 month, 7 were dead for seriously wounded, leaving only 8. Their mission was brutally simple, yet lethally dangerous: crawl into no-man, land under cover of darkness and plant mines, right under the Germans' noses. Everyone thought Mikhail was a terrible combat engineer because he worked too slowly. Others could plant 3 or 4 mines a night, while he struggled to bury 1, maybe 2. Squad leader Sergeant Kuznets have never stopped berating him. Tatarinov, what are you doing? Asleep. Everyone else has pulled back and you are still dawdling. Mikhail never talked back. He was indeed slow, but not because he was clumsy. He was observing. Every time he crawled into no-man land, he spent considerable time scouting the terrain, carefully examining hidden trails in the snow. He memorized the positions of German sentry posts and even figured out where illumination flares most frequently landed. Other engineers planted mines by the book. Dig a 30-centimeter hole, cover with snow, space them 5 meters apart. But Mikhail's approach was completely different. On the night of January 17th, he carried to PMD-6 anti-lines and crept into no-man land. These were the most common wooden -case mines, each containing 200 grams of TNT. enough to blow off a grown man's leg instantly. Mikhail kept the mines in a cloth bag pressed tight against his stomach for warmth, terrified the explosives might freeze. Once the NT froze solid, it became extremely unstable, and the slightest bump could trigger a chain explosion. He crawled to a spot he had scouted 3 days earlier, a shallow ditch between two small snow drifts, only 70 meters from the German trenches. The location itself was unremarkable, and no commander would have ordered a mine placed there. But Mikhail had noticed something. 3 small paths converged in this shallow ditch. The first ran from the German bunker to the latrine, the second from the trench to a camouflaged machine gun position, and the third from the observation post to the communication trench. 3 paths from 3 directions, all meeting at a single intersection. It was exactly like the game trails in the taiga, where animals always converged at watering holes or salt licks. Mikhail planted the first mine precisely at the center of the intersection, and the second less than 3 meters away on the path leading to the latrine. The entire job took him only 40 minutes, less time than others needed for a single mine. The difference was that he had spent 3 entire nights scouting and observing to prepare for those 40 minutes. The results came 2 days later, at 6:12 on the morning of January 19th. 2 massive explosions rang out from the German positions, separated by exactly 14 seconds. Then came piercing screams and intense gunfire as the Germans, thinking a Soviet assault was underway, blazed away at the empty no-man land. The Soviet observation post saw everything clearly to dead. 3 wounded, 2 mines had taken out 5 Germans. This result was 2.5 times the platoon average, a staggering statistic that demanded attention. That evening, Lieutenant Orlov summoned Mikhail to the bunker. The platoon leader wanted answers. Orlov was only 20-6, a Moscow engineer before the war, with thin wire-framed glasses and a scholarly face. But his hands were calloused from gripping a combat engineer shovel. He studied Mikhail with keen interest. Tatarinov, level with me? What exactly is going on? 2 mines took out 5 Germans, while Kuznetsov planted 4 and hit nothing. Mikhail stammered, unsure how to explain. To him, it was as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. Comrade Lieutenant, I just plant the mines where the Germans walk, Mikhail offered as his simple explanation. Does not everyone plant them where the Germans walk? The platoon leader countered with genuine puzzlement. Mikhail shook his head. No, everyone plants them where the Germans might pass, but I plant them where they will definitely pass. That is a crucial difference, Mikhail insisted, and Orlov removed his glasses and wiped them, thinking deeply. Tell me in detail, Orlov said, and Mikhail tried to explain about the 3 paths and the intersection. He also talked about sables, Arctic foxes, and gray wolves, about how his father taught him to read tracks, and about the principle that beasts and humans are not so different, both follow patterns and habits. Orlov listened quietly, then asked, so you are treating the Germans like wild animals? Not like animals, Mikhail shook his head, but as creatures with fixed habits, every species travels the same paths. What we need to do is observe and remember. Orlov was silent for a minute, then put his glasses back on. Starting tomorrow, you are excused from regular duties, operate independently, and report results once a week. That moment became the turning point of his destiny. Over the next 3 months, Mikhail began keeping records of everything he observed. The 216th Rifle Division commander, Colonel Savlev, studied Mikhail with the look of someone examining a rare exotic creature. So you are the Yakut lad who catches Germans like sables. Mikhail reported everything honestly, and the colonel listened while shaking his head and interjecting questions. Finally, he stared at Mikhail and asked, so you think Germans are like wild animals, that they only follow the same paths? Comrade Colonel, absolutely. Humans are creatures ruled by habit, especially in war. War is tedious repetition: patrol, guard duty, eat, sleep, the same routine every day. Once you understand the enemy daily patterns, you can precisely predict where they will appear next. Zavlev fell silent for a moment, then turned to Orlov. "Lieutenant, this soldier is now your platoon most valuable asset. Give him whatever he needs. I only want results." But the truly chilling slaughter was only just beginning. Mikhail had keenly identified the limitations of conventional mines. The PM-6 anti-minus personnel mine was extremely simple, a wooden box containing 200 grams of TNT with a pressure fuse. One mine for one life, the most primitive arithmetic. But Mikhail was thinking far beyond that. In the taiga, a sable trap catches only one sable at a time. But when hunting wolves, if you set your traps cleverly enough, you can wipe out an entire pack. Wolves are social animals, and when one falls into a trap, its companions will never abandon it. They gather around, frantically trying to rescue their pack mate, sometimes thrashing about in agitation. If you surround the first trap with a series of linked traps, you can annihilate the entire pack. Germans were just like wolves. Mikhail had observed this dozens of times from hiding. Whenever one German soldier stepped on a mine, the others never ran. They shouted for medics and swarmed to help, clustering around the wounded. If that was the case, why not exploit this behavior? In May 1940-2, he constructed his first chain trap. 3 mines connected by thin wire. The first mine planted on the inevitable path, and when a German soldier stepped on it, the blast would instantly yank the wire, which in turn pulled the pin from a grenade attached to the second mine 5 meters away. Exactly 4 seconds later, the grenade detonated, precisely when other Germans would be rushing to aid the first casualty. The shrapnel would unerringly cut down 2 or 3 more, followed by total panic. Amid the screams, someone would turn to flee, only to step on the third mine already hidden along the retreat route. When Lieutenant Orlov saw the trap blueprint, he was silent for a long time. Then he wiped his glasses and warned sternly, "This seriously violates operating regulations. There is nothing like this in the combat engine airfield manual." Mikhail did not back down. "I know it is a violation, but it absolutely works." "How do you know it works?" "Because I already tested it." Orlov's head snapped up when, the night before last, right across from Hill 1-14. 3 mines and 1 grenade, result 7 men. 5 killed outright, 2 seriously wounded. This was the first combat test of the chain trap, but far from the last. Over the next 3 months, Mikhail developed 6 different types of combined traps. Each mechanism more ingenious than the last, each more devastatingly lethal. His second major invention was the bait trap. He noticed that German soldiers had a particular weakness for battlefield souvenirs. Whenever they spotted a watch, cigarette case, or canteen in no-man land, their eyes would light up and they would scoop it up without hesitation. Human greed was as predictable as animal movements. He began laying bait a finely crafted officer belt with a grenade secretly attached underneath. When a German soldier gleefully lifted the belt, he also pulled the grenade pin, and for seconds later his midsection would be blown apart. A canteen half-minus, buried in dirt, concealed a pull-minus fuse underneath. A document case full of maps was an irresistible lure for German scouts. But Mikhail's third invention was the truly horrifying killer move, what he called the wailing trap. The inspiration came from childhood memories when his father told him how even key hunters caught bears. They mimicked the cries of an injured fawn, and the bear, following the sound, would fall into a pit lined with sharpened stakes. Sound attracts prey, and sound can make people lose their reason. Mikhail found a way to make noisemakers from discarded tin cans when a wire was pulled taut, specially shaped and vibrating, and the wind would produce a sound eerily similar to a human wail. He placed these devices next to the corpse of a German soldier in the combat zone. At night, when the wind blew, the tin began to wail, and the Germans in the trenches heard what they thought was a wounded comrade crying out in agony. They immediately dispatched medics to the rescue. What awaited those medics was a dense field of mines surrounding the body. Before long, terrifying rumors about the Yakut Shaman spread through the German trenches like plague. Prisoners captured by Soviet reconnaissance reported that German soldiers now refused to set foot in the combat zone. They dared not pick up objects from the ground, dared not rescue wounded comrades, and even felt terror with every breath. This was exactly the result Mikhail wanted. The destructive power of fear was no less than that of mines. A terrified soldier makes constant mistakes, lies awake all night, and ultimately loses all vigilance. However, not everyone in the Soviet Red Army approved of Mikhail's methods. On August 20-7th, 1940-2, he was urgently summoned to the division's special department. State security kept in Vinogradov sat inside a bunker paneled with captured German boards, approximately 30-5 years old, with gaunt cheeks, thin lips, and eyes cold as ice, staring at Mikhail the way an entomologist examines a rare insect. Soldier Tatarinov. Vinogradov began without even offering him a seat. I have been reported some strange things. I hear your traps cannot be found in any field manual. I hear you cobble together weapons from scrap metal, and I even hear you use corpses as bait. Is all this true? Comrade Captain, every bit of it is true. What for? To kill Germans. Comrade Captain, you can kill Germans with rifles, machine guns, mortars. Why make it so complicated? Mikhail fell silent. He did not know how to explain. To him, it was as natural as breathing. Discover patterns, exploit patterns, predict prey movements, then set traps at the most lethal points. This was how he had lived since childhood, how his father, his grandfather, and all his ancestors had hunted. Vinogradov leaned forward. Let me tell you what I think. I think you are a sadist. You derive pleasure from other people's deaths. You enjoy devising ever more elaborate ways to kill. That is a pathology. Mikhail felt a chill rise within him, not fear or anger, but something he could not name. He chose his words carefully before speaking. Comrade Captain, I do not enjoy killing. I am a hunter, and hunters do not derive pleasure from death. They simply do their work. There is only one difference between me and a rifleman. A rifleman can see his prey eyes. He squeezes the trigger and watches the man fall. But I cannot see the eyes. I set my traps and leave. When the mines explode, I am not even there. This may be cowardice, but it is absolutely not sadism. Vinogradov stared at him for a long time, then leaned back. Your combat record is indeed remarkable. In just 5 months you have killed more Germans than any sniper in the division. The High Command is pleased with you, so I can turn a blind eye to your methods. But remember this, I will be watching you. If you cross the line, if you use these skills against anyone other than the enemy, I will show you exactly what the special department is capable of. Mikhail walked out of the bunker and stood motionless in the cold wind for several minutes, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from anger. He knew Vinogradov was wrong, that he was no sadist. But he also knew he could not explain the truth. The real truth was far more complicated. Mikhail was afraid of killing. Whenever he imagined looking someone in the eye and pulling the trigger, he felt a powerful wave of nausea. He was physiologically incapable of it. Back at the Yakutsk training ground, he had missed the target not because he could not aim, but because his subconscious had fought desperately against hitting it. Traps became his way of killing without seeing blood, his only means of preserving his sanity in a war that demanded endless killing. Whether this was cowardice or profound wisdom, Mikhail himself could not say. He only knew that this was the only way both his body and spirit could survive the battlefield. By the spring of 1940-3, Mikhail bunker had become a veritable armory. Wooden shelves held powder cans, TNT blocks, and spools of wire of various thicknesses. Pliers, tin snips, and files lay scattered on the table. In one corner sat a crate of captured German M24 stick grenades. Their fuses were indeed better, more reliable, and more precisely timed than the Soviet versions. Lieutenant Orlov occasionally dropped by, sitting on an ammunition crate at the door, watching Mikhail work in silence. Once he could not help asking Tatarinov, "Do you understand that when this war is over, all these killing devices will be useless? What do you plan to do then?" Mikhail shrugged, returned to the Taga, trap sables like my father. And these? Orlov pointed at the mines on the table. Can you forget them? Mikhail did not answer. He did not know if he could ever forget. In July 1940-3, at the Kursk salient, the 216th Division was urgently transferred to the Central Front. The largest battle in human history was about to unfold on the Kursk steppes. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and tens of thousands of artillery pieces. Mikhail looked at this earth-minus, shattering array and wondered in this torrent of steel, where is there room for a trapper like me? On July 15th, Lieutenant Orlov called him over, his face extremely grave, even ominous. He handed Mikhail a map. Look carefully. Krasny, Bor village, 12 kilometers west. Reconnaissance just brought in intelligence the Germans are retreating, a German column of about 200 men with equipment. They will take this road through the forest. Top brass has ordered that this unit must be pinned down until our tanks arrive. We have 4 hours. Mikhail studied the map. An arrow forest road sandwiched between a swamp and a deep ravine. 400 meters long, an absolutely perfect killing ground for traps. He felt something inside him jolt, the hunter instinct that had been dormant for months awakening completely. Can you give me some men? Orlov removed his glasses and warily rubbed his temples. The men are exhausted. 3, at most. 3 men against 200. Mikhail looked at the map again. 400 meters of road, swamp on the left, ravine on the right. The only way through. For the first time in months, he smiled. Comrade Lieutenant, I do not need men, I need mines. Give me all the mines in the platoon and for hours. Orlov looked at him silently, then nodded. All yours. But if you mess this up. No buts, Mikhail interrupted. I was born for this. At 20-3 in the afternoon on July 15th, 1940-3, Mikhail Tatarinov was sprinting down a forest path. His pack held 20-8 kilograms of death. The blazing sun stung his eyes with sweat. His boots struggled through muddy ruts. He had 3 hours and 30-7 minutes before the German column passed through. 50 meters behind him, 3 soldiers were gasping to keep up. Private Semya Novi, Private Kokorev, and Corporal Lukin, each carrying 2 crates of mines, 60 kilograms between the 3 of them. Combined with Mikhail 20-8, that was 80-8 kilograms of explosives, wire, fuses, and metal fragments. If his calculations were right, this arsenal would be more than enough for the Germans, provided his terrain assessment was correct and there was enough time to set everything up. At 3-11 in the afternoon, they reached the roadside. Mikhail stopped at the tree line and held his breath. Everything before him matched the map exactly. It was even more perfect than the map suggested. A 4-meter wide dirt road ran east to west, and less than 20 meters to the left was a peat bog with green scum and floating duckweed. 15 meters to the right, a ravine 7 or 8 meters deep with steep walls overgrown with nettles and burdock, a small stream at the bottom. Between the swamp and the ravine, this road was the only passage. It pasted out exactly 412 meters. Mikhail crouched and began surveying the terrain like a wolf, his hunter eyes catching details ordinary people would miss. The grass at the roadside was trampled, meaning someone had passed recently. The ruts were particularly deep, meaning vehicles would have to slow down here. A fallen tree lying across the road ahead squeezed the road down to 3 meters wide. The perfect position for the first chain mine. He inventoried his supplies. 12 PMD-, 6 anti-, personnel mines, 8 PMs E- to fragmentation mines, 16 RGD-, 33 grenades, 14 captured German M24 stick grenades, 3 spools of thin steel wire, 2 spools of thick iron wire, 1 ball of hemp rope, 20 wooden stakes, plus 6 home-made devices in canvas bags, his latest inventions that had never been tested in combat. Mikhail pulled out his sketched plans and began assigning tasks. Semyon Novi takes the first 100 meters. For PM to mines on the road spaced 20 meters apart, Kokorev takes the next 100. For mines on the road plus for trip minus, wire mines between the road and the ravine and the trees. Lukin stays with him for the 3rd and 4th sections, the hardest parts. At 3:20-3, 2 hours and 30-7 minutes before the column was expected, they had less than 3 hours to set 80-9 traps. Over the next 2 hours, Mikhail worked harder than he ever had in his life, his hands operating like a machine, while his brain calculated angles, distances, and trajectories at lightning speed. He planted mines entirely by instinct, not by the manual. A bend ahead meant the lead driver would brake, so plant one at the right front wheel position. A small mound by the roadside meant soldiers jumping from trucks would instinctively step on higher ground rather than into puddles, so plant one beneath the mound. A patch of elderberry bushes meant someone would try to take cover behind them once the firing started, so string a trip-minus wire across the most natural path. He thought like a reindeer. If an explosion happened ahead, where would I run? Away from the road, into the trees, so plant mines along the escape routes into the forest. He thought like a wolf. If ambushed, where would I hide? Behind trees, in the ravine, in any depression, so set traps in all the obvious shelters. He thought like a human. If my comrade was hit, what would I do? Rush to help, so plant a second mine near the first, but not too close, 3 or 4 meters away, exactly the distance someone could run into seconds. The pit traps were the most time-minus consuming. Mikhail dug 8 pits 1.5 meters deep, each lined with sharpened wooden stakes, not metal but wood. He cut spruce branches from the ravine edge, whittled them needle-minus sharp with his knife, and charred the surface with a lighter to make them rock-minus-hard. This was a skill his father taught him, the same kind of trap used for bears. When a bear falls in, the stake spears its paws and it can never climb out. Humans are not bears, lighter and more fragile. The stakes would only penetrate deeper. He covered the pits with thin branches, scattered rotting soil, dead leaves, and weeds, making them indistinguishable from the surrounding forest floor, even to someone staring right at them. All 8 pit traps were positioned in the woods to the right of the road, along the enemy, likely escape route toward the ravine. 8 pits, 30-2 stakes each, 250-6 sharpened wooden stakes in total, silently waiting to tear through human flesh. He brought 30-1 animal traps, not real ones but home-made mechanisms bent from steel wire. If someone stepped on a hidden snare, the loop would clamp tight around their ankle and the iron spikes would doctor directly into flesh. These contraptions would not kill, but they would make a man unable to move, and in a minefield, being unable to move was a death sentence. He placed these wire snares in the grass on both sides of the road, at spots where people would instinctively place their feet, small rises, beside mounds at the base of trees, where the foot naturally sought a stable footing. Finally, he camouflaged them with fallen leaves and pine needles. Last, he installed 6 special devices, 3 chain traps, each linking for mines together so that a single detonation would trigger a chain reaction to wailing traps with tin noisemakers placed beside 2 German soldier corpses found by the roadside. And the final mechanism, the most lethal of all, what Mikhail called the Gate of Life. At the eastern end of the 4-100-meter killing zone, where the road widened again, he deliberately left a gap about 2 meters wide with no mines, no trip wires, no snares. At first glance, this appeared to be the only escape route. But in reality, this Gate of Life was the deadliest trap of all. 5 fragmentation mines were not buried in the ground but lashed to trees, fixed to the trunks of poplar trees at chest height. Their fuses were connected by a single thin wire strung across the passage, only 10 centimeters above the ground. When fleeing soldiers, desperate to escape the explosions, saw this unobstructed passage, they would charge through without hesitation. The moment a foot caught the wire, all 5 mines would detonate simultaneously in mid-minus air, and the metal casings of the fragmentation mines would spray lethal shrapnel across every square meter within a 30-meter radius. At 5:40-1 in the afternoon, Mikhail finished. He stood on a small hill 300 meters from the road, surveying his creation. Nothing was visible. The road looked exactly as it had 3 hours ago. Even though death lurked in every meter of ground, there was not the slightest trace on the surface. 80-9 traps, he mentally tallied. 12 mines on the road, 16 trip-wire mines in the forest, 8 pit traps, 30-1 wire snares, 3 chain arrays, to sound decoys, 5 tree-mounted mines at the gate of life. The total killing power was more than sufficient for 200 men, assuming everything detonated as planned. At 6-0-3 in the evening, Mikhail heard the rumble of engines. The sound was distant, faint. He raised his binoculars and the western end of the road was still empty, but the rumbling grew louder. "Here they come," he whispered. "Get ready. No matter what happens, do not move, do not fire, do not even breathe heavily." The 3 soldiers pressed themselves flat against the ground. Mikhail remained motionless, eyes fixed on the binoculars, his heartbeat steady, his hands steady as rock. He felt a strange calm. The traps were set, the death road was laid, the prey was approaching. Everything that needed to be done was done. The rest was up to fate. At 6-7, a lead motorcycle rounded the corner, a BMW R75 with a sidecar machine gunner in the rear seat. Behind it followed a canvas-covered Opel Blitz truck, then a second, a third. Mikhail counted silently. 7 trucks, 2 motorcycles, and sandwiched in the middle of the column was a sedan, a staff car for an officer. The commander was here too. The column slowly entered the 4-100-meter death zone. The Germans looked around nervously, knowing they were close to the front lines and that partisans could be lurking anywhere, but they had absolutely no idea that death had been waiting here for them. At 6-9, the lead motorcycle reached the fallen tree blocking part of the road and the driver braked. The motorcycle front wheel rolled over a small mound on the left side of the rut. Mikhail held his breath. Beneath that mound lay the first mine. At 6-9 the 200 grams of TNT inside the PMT-6 mine wooden case detonated instantly. The explosion hurled the motorcycle into the air, tearing the driver in half and flinging the sidecar gunner 7 meters onto the roadside where he lay motionless. Mikhail lay on the hillside 300 meters away, watching through binoculars, counting silently 1, 2, 3. The column screeched to a halt, soldiers in the trucks screaming in German. 4, 5, 6. Cab doors worked open, drivers bailed out. The officer in the staff car was bellowing orders. 7. Several soldiers started sprinting toward the burning motorcycle. It was exactly as Mikhail had predicted, like wolves rushing to a fallen pack mate. The first soldier crouched to check the gunner pulse. The second stood with rifle raised, scanning the surroundings. The third turned and shouted toward the column. None of them looked at their feet. The second soldier, trying to get a better view, took a step to the left. His boot caught a thin wire 5 centimeters above the ground. The trip-wire mine triggered instantly, and an RGD-33 gren, it strapped to a tree 3 meters away, it exploded at chest height, its shrapnel cutting down all 3 men like a scythe through wheat. The entire column erupted in chaos. German soldiers poured out of the trucks like ants from a disturbed nest, scrambling in panic in every direction. This was exactly what Mikhail wanted. Panic spread rapidly. Soldiers fled the road, plunging into the woods on both sides, some toward the ravine on the right, others toward the swamp on the left, seeking cover from an invisible reaper. They had no idea there was no cover here. Every step away from the road was a step toward death. The first group of 5 ran to the right and plunged into the spruce thicket that was trap pit number 3, 3 meters across, 1.5 meters deep, with 30-2 sharpened stakes at the bottom. The lead soldier's scream was cut short by a sickening crunch of bone and flesh. The second could not stop in time and tumbled in after him. The third managed to break at the edge, but the ground beneath his feet gave way. The remaining 2 stood frozen at the pit edge, watching their comrades impaled on the stakes below. One of them recoiled in horror and stepped on a snare. The steel wire clamped tight around his ankle, and rusted iron spikes drove deep into his flesh. In the 4th minute, screams erupted from the swamp on the left as well. 3 soldiers tried to wade through the mire. The first sank to his knees, the second desperately tried to pull him out, and the third stepped on what looked like a solid little mound. Beneath that mound lay a mine. The violent explosion sent a fountain of peat and filthy water, into the air, hurling 2 men into the swamp where the mud instantly swallowed them. Mikhail silently counted the explosions, 3 on the road, 4 in the woods to the right, 2 at the swamp edge. In just 4 minutes, 9 massive blasts. By his estimate, about 20-5 men were already out of action, leaving 170-5. In the 5th and 6th minutes, he had to admit the German officer was competent. Mikhail watched him rapidly organize a defense, soldiers taking cover behind trucks, machine gunners setting up their weapons and blazing away blindly into the woods on both sides. They had completely failed to understand that the enemy was not in the trees. The enemy was beneath their feet. Mikhail waited quietly. He knew what would happen next. This officer had to make a decision: hold position or retreat. Holding was impossible. The entire column was exposed on the road like a target, and once Soviet tanks arrived, they were all dead. Retreating backward would not work either, as the burning motorcycles and unknown mines lay behind them. That left only one option: push forward, toward the eastern end of the road, toward the gate of life that Mikhail had specially prepared for them. At 6-15, the officer gave the order. The column began creeping forward with excruciating caution, the lead truck moving slower than a walking man, soldiers hugging the vehicle sides and staring at every inch of ground beneath their feet. They had learned their lesson, but too slowly. 20 meters ahead of the officer car, the truck hit a mine. The explosion shredded the front wheels, and the massive vehicle swung across the road, completely blocking the way forward. More screams, more panic. Soldiers again scattered into the woods like headless flies, and explosions followed one after another. In the 7th and 8th minutes, chain trap number 2 performed flawlessly. A soldier stepped on a mine beside a thick oak tree, and the blast yanked a wire that instantly pulled the pin from a grain 8-10 meters away. For seconds later, just as 6 Germans were trying to take cover behind a fallen log, the grenade exploded among them. Shrapnel swept in a fan pattern, cutting down 5 men instantly. The 6th turned and ran in terror, falling straight into trap at number 5. At that moment, Mikhail heard the sound he had been waiting for. From the direction of the main road came a drawn minus out, blood minus curdling wail. It was the tin plate beside the dead German soldier corpse, vibrating in the wind. Several Germans heard it too, thinking it was a wounded comrade groaning in agony. 3 men rushed toward the sound without hesitation. 18, 19, 20 explosions in 8 minutes. Mikhail roughly calculated about 50 dead and an equal number wounded or incapacitated. In the 9th and 10th minutes, the German officer finally understood. Through his binoculars, Mikhail could clearly see the man pale, contorted face etched with terror. The officer finally grasped that this entire stretch of road was an enormous meat grinder, that every step in any direction could be his last, and that an invisible reaper was harvesting his men's lives without firing a single shot. The officer was screaming orders. Mikhail could not make out the words but could guess perfectly: retreat west at all costs, go back the way they came. The surviving 70 or so men began a desperate withdrawal, running back along the road, carefully stepping in the existing wheel ruts, believing the ruts were safe. They were dead wrong. When they first entered this stretch, Mikhail had indeed left the ruts clear to draw the entire column deep into the ambush. But in the middle section, the ruts were also mined. 20-2, 20-3, 20-4. The explosions merged into a continuous, unending thunderclap. Soldiers fell in swaths like wheat before a sieve. Some stepped on mines, others hit snares and were pinned in place, only to be torn apart by subsequent blasts. Still others were simply struck down by shrapnel from nearby explosions and never got up again. The officer was running at the front. He was almost out of the death zone, just 30 more meters, and he would have escaped this hell. Mikhail watched him expressionlessly. He knew what was waiting for the officer: the final trap, specifically designed for the smartest ones, those who saw through the pattern and tried to escape. In the 11th minute, the officer saw the exit, a clean stretch of road with no craters and no blast marks. A 2-meter wide safe passage between 2 tall poplar trees. He sprinted toward it madly, followed by 7 others. They were the last survivors of his group. Mikhail held his breath as he watched through binoculars from the hillside. The officer reached the gate of life. His foot caught the thin wire 10 centimeters above the ground. 5 fragmentation mines detonated simultaneously, their metal casings bursting apart and spraying lethal shrapnel across a 30-meter radius. Mikhail turned his head away. He did not want to look. He never wanted to witness the moment of death with his own eyes. That was the entire meaning of his method: kill but never look into the prey eyes, preserving his sanity in a world where reason had become a luxury. At 6:20 in the evening, deathly silence fell after 11 minutes of continuous explosions, the sudden quiet more terrifying than the blasts. The silence rang in the ears. Mikhail slowly raised his binoculars and scanned the devastated road below. All 7 trucks were wrecked, some still burning, both motorcycles reduced to scrap metal on the road. Staff car doors stood wide open and empty inside. Bodies lay scattered across the road into the forest. Too many to count. Mikhail tried to count, but gave up at 50. There were simply too many bodies scattered across the battlefield. "Comrade Sergeant," Kokorev whispered, "what do we do now?" "Wait 10 more minutes, then withdraw," Mikhail replied. But Kokorev persisted. "There are still living men down there." Mikhail knew perfectly well there were living men below. He could hear sounds of pain and desperate cries for help. But he would absolutely not go down. The wounded were not his concern. His job was done. "The living are the medic's responsibility," he said coldly. "Ours or theirs? Neither has anything to do with us." 2 hours later, a Soviet reconnaissance team reached the road, followed by several tanks. Mikhail went to meet them, unlead them, lead them through the death zone along the safe path he had deliberately left clear. 8 tank platoon commanders stared at the devastated road. "Too shocked to speak you for did all this?" "Not for people," Mikhail replied calmly. 80-9 traps. The official battle damage assessment came out the next day. 80-9 killed. 40-3 wounded, including 20-7 seriously. 11 surrendered, including 2 officers. A German column of roughly 200 men had plunged into this for -100-meter death stretch. Fewer than 60 had survived intact. 11 minutes of combat, and the Soviet Red Army had not fired a single shot. Mikhail Tatarinov was awarded the Order of the Red Star for his extraordinary service at Krasny Bor. Lieutenant Orlov had wanted to nominate him for Hero of the Soviet Union, but the brass decided his methods were too unconventional. State Security Captain Vinogradov summoned him again, staring into his eyes for a long time before sighing deeply. "I misjudged you before. You are definitely not a sadist. You are something I cannot even define. A kind of creature I still cannot figure out. I have no idea what goes on inside your head." Mikhail said nothing. Because even he did not know. On May 9th, 1940-5, the war ended and Mikhail had fought all the way to Königsberg. In the 3 years after the Krasny Bor ambush, he set over 400 more traps across the Eastern Front. Exactly how many Germans died at his hands was beyond calculation. Conservative estimates ranged between 300 and 400. And throughout the entire war, he never once pulled a trigger, not a single bullet fired from his rifle. In the autumn of 1940-5, he returned to his home village of Santar, where his old father stood waiting at the door. The old man had aged, his hair gone completely white, but he was alive, which was more than many fathers could say. His mother had died of pneumonia. In 1940-3, Mikhail did not cry when he received the news. His tears had frozen away long ago in the ice and snow of Tikhvn, where the war had first broken him and remade him. In 1940-7, he married a school teacher from the next village, Maria Dmitrievna, and they built a life together. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, and Mikhail returned to being a hunter in the vast Siberian taiga, disappearing into the taiga for weeks at a time, setting traps for sables and Arctic foxes, and returning with fine furs. He never spoke to anyone about the war. His children only knew their father had been a soldier. A wooden box in the cupboard held a medal, but they knew nothing of his battlefield experiences or the men he had killed. Once Maria could not help asking why he always shouted in his sleep, and Mikhail answered simply, "I dream of wolves." He was not lying. He did dream of wolves every night, dozens of them running along forest paths in the darkness, falling into traps, caught in snares, blown apart by mines. The wolves died in all the ways he had designed for men. And all the wolves had human eyes, staring at him with the gaze of the men whose lives he had erased. On March 12, 1980-7, Mikhail Tatarinov passed away at the age of 60-6. He died of a heart attack while hunting in the forest 50 kilometers from Suntar, alone as he had always been. It was 3 full days before anyone found him, sitting quietly by a campfire, still holding a trap he had not had time to set. His death was the epitome of his entire life alone, in the taiga, doing what he did best until the very end. His gravestone made no mention of the war, only a simple wooden cross with his name and date scarved into the surface. Beside him lay his wife Maria, who passed in 1990-2, and his father Yegor, who died in 1960-1. 3 generations of Tatar in no VS, all hunters, all trappers, all men of the taiga, bound by bloodened by the forest. In 2015, his grandson Yegor found the old notebook in a trunk, small, tattered, its pages yellowed with age. The notebook was filled with sketches, dozens of diagrams of chain traps, snares, and mine arrays, drawn neatly, unannotated. On the very last page, written in pencil, was a single sentence: "A good hunter never shoots. A good hunter uses his brain." Yegor stared at those words for a long time, then closed the notebook and locked it back in the trunk. Some things are better left in the past, yet the question still lingers in the river of history, unanswered and unanswerable. A man who could not bear to look someone in the eye and kill them, yet found a way to slaughter without watching his victims die. A man who erased hundreds of German lives to save hundreds of Soviet soldiers. What kind of person was he? A hero who devoted his gift to his homeland, or a coward who hid behind mechanisms because he could not face a bayonet charge? Or perhaps he was simply a pure hunter in a world that drove him to the edge, doing the only thing he knew how to do. More than 80 years have passed since that blood-soaked battle at Krasny Bor, but the question remains unanswered to this day. If you want more stories about the most cunning warriors in military history, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. I am your battlefield chronicler, bringing the untold stories of war to light. See you on the next front.